I'm Peter, and this is the Tarot Table with Bonnie and Peter, where we lay the cards on the table and talk about life, tarot, and everything in between. So shuffle your deck, pull up a chair, and join us at the Tarot Table. Hi, I'm Peter, and we're the Tarot Table with Bonnie and Peter. Thank you for joining us today on episode 10. And what we're going to talk about today is what happens when you're working with the tarot, either yourself or somebody else, even a client, and you draw blank. You can't remember what the card sitting in front of you means. So the first thing I want to tell you is, regardless of your level of experience, this happens to everybody from time to time. Everybody from time to time. So the first thing I would suggest is don't panic that you're going to encounter this situation. I always think if you work with the tarot long enough, if you read tarot cards long enough, this situation is going to happen to you. Bonnie, it's happened to you.
Oh, for sure.
It's happened to me. I can't, I'm just trying to think of a time where it's happened to me while I was working with a client. It hasn't happened yet. The partial blanks will happen, and we'll talk, some of the strategies that we're going to talk about today will help. So the first thing I want to say is, don't worry that this happens. And what Bonnie and I are going to talk to you today are about perhaps some cautions before you start working with the tarot, some of the reasons why you might draw a blank, and then some suggestions around what you can do if and when this happens to you. So the first thing, and I will repeat that, is give yourself, a little bit of forgiveness. Give yourself some compassion here, and recognize that that this is going to happen. So when it does, just offer yourself a little bit of forgiveness. A good way to avoid that, though, might be to do a little bit of a check-in first and know yourself before you go in to work with the cards. So if you are in an agitated state, or if you're in a highly emotional state, if you're looking for guidance from the cards immediately after something has happened, might not be the best time to go and seek guidance or advice. Or what you can do is, if you had a grounding or a calming or a breathing technique that you brought with you before you work with the cards, might also help put your emotional state on an even keel. I know for me, when I go and I work with the cards, I have a little bit of a breathing ritual. I actually picture my feet rooting themselves to the ground. I slow my breathing down. I do what I've always called a lazy 8 style breathing, which is, kind of 4 in, 4 hold, 4 in, 4 hold. Because I find what it does is it regulates my emotional state regardless of how I'm feeling when I go to the cards. So that, I think, is important. That might help regulate you before you do your work, and maybe reduce the likelihood that you are going to draw that blank, that, distractions, or your emotional state, or even, being tired is going to impact, how you work. I don't know, Bonnie, what do you think? If this is, because I know I've had this happen to me, especially when I'm working with the cards on my own. What about you? Anything to offer that I didn't cover? Because this will be different for both of us, I would imagine.
No, same. I think that's great. Like, I love what you said about not sort of being in this like super emotional state. Sometimes that's when we want to turn to the cards, is, something happens and we're really upset, or we're angry, or, we want to turn to the cards to maybe calm us down, or get some resolution. But I think in that heightened state, I think it can affect how you're working with the cards. So I personally don't do that, even though sometimes I want to. I do exactly what you do. I try to, I do some breath work, I ground myself, and then try to calm myself that way rather than turning to the cards, because I don't think, necessarily we're in we have like, not really getting a lot of clarity when we're, really agitated or in that state. So
Yeah.
definitely agree with that.
And I always wonder too if the cards, if there is an energetic connection with the cards, and if we're thinking that the cards are presenting themselves the information that we need to know right here, right now, in this time and in this space. Well, what happens when the energy that we're bringing to the cards is that frazzled energy or that excited energy? And you
Mhm.
said, well, we want to calm down. And I think, what's going to happen. We're going to want to go to the cards to calm down. And what card are we going to pull? We're going to pull the death card, or we're going to pull,
Or the
the devil,
tower.
right? The tower's coming out. And it's like, the card of chaos and destruction and ending. And, that's going to do nothing whatsoever to calm our state. And I wouldn't be surprised because I sometimes think that tarot has a great sense of humor. I
Mhm.
wouldn't be surprised if that's the time that your tarot deck picks to throw some of those challenging cards your way. Um, yeah, so I think we both agree on that. Don't go to the cards at a time. They're certainly a great guide for guidance,
Mhm.
but you want to make sure that you're not in a state of almost chaos and dysregulation when you
Right.
when you go there. And you can't be right. I mean, that's we can our emotions always go up and down, but making sure that that we're kind of at a state of equilibrium, because I also think that state can probably impact our ability to remember the cards, despite the fact that we have a good, solid foundation in card knowledge. If we're going there and we're completely consumed by the issue in front of us, that's going to be the time where, the Five of Swords comes up and you're like, what does that card mean again? What? Oh, Five of Swords. I. That's when it's going to happen. It's going to just. It's going to escape. Um,
Well, and when you're in a state of stress, right? Like a lot of other things shut down, right? Because you're prepared to fight or run away or freeze.
mhm.
So you don't have this broader you don't have access to like more clarity or broader thinking
Right.
because you're very tunnel vision at
Mhm.
that point, right? So yeah, definitely you're probably going to have a harder time
Yeah.
remembering what that card means or maybe having a broader perspective of that too. So
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
that's a typical stress-based response to being in an agitated state. Because you're right. We want to freeze, flee, or fight.
Yep,
So,
exactly.
um,
So then,
go
oh,
ahead.
sorry,
Yeah.
go
No,
ahead.
no, no. You go. By all means.
So what would be your first, I guess, well, maybe I'll chime in here, but like if you pull a card
Yeah.
and or if, you have a few different cards and you come across a card and you're like, oh, like what do I do? I think my top suggestion would be just take a breath and
Mm,
don't panic. I think you
yeah.
mentioned that earlier. It's just like I've done this before when I'm reading for other people. A card comes up and I'm really having a hard time either figuring out where this card fits into the story that's coming up, or maybe it doesn't seem to make sense with the question that the person has
Mhm.
asked. But I literally just take a breath and I just look at the card. Nobody's going to judge you for taking your time to see what's coming up. And sometimes we need that moment of pause to look at the card and have time, for those insights to come up. So I think that would be my number one tip is like take a breath and just take a moment. It's okay. Nobody's rushing you to come up with an answer right away.
Yeah. And that what a great suggestion. And I even think even if you're going in to do your work in a regulated state, that is still a great piece of advice for anyone working with the cards, because you need time to create that narrative so that the idea of connecting the card to the question that you're asking or to the event or incident that you're looking on insight or guidance for, or if it's your style, I always think like mine, to draw multiple cards at the same time, even to build the narrative, to connect one card to the next. And in, I guess, in a related way, taking that time to just breathe and to sit with the card for a moment, even when you're working with someone else, does let those meanings come through. And you're absolutely right. Nobody is going to fault you for taking time, especially if it's taking time to get it right. Um,
And you can even say like, oh, I just need a minute to sit with this
Yeah.
card, right? Like, and people appreciate that because they're like, oh, what's
Mhm.
going on, right? So I think that's perfectly acceptable and absolutely normal. I mean, that happens a lot. So
The only thing from somebody who works with clients, the only thing that I would, if you're going to do that, don't drop a general comment, especially if you're working in an avenue like this one where the person doesn't see the cards until you hold them up. Don't
oh,
put two or three cards down and go, "Oh, that's interesting." Oh, and then
right. I'm
pause.
thinking face to
No, I
face.
know with face to face for sure. But I only say that because I have done that from time to time, where immediately you're like, oh, what an interesting story this tells, realizing that your client who's at the other end of a Zoom or an online call
Mhm.
can't actually see the cards
Right.
until you hold them up. Because I don't, I know some people work with a dual camera system. I tried it. I find it completely distracting. But anyways, um, uh, so I know from a practical, so we talked about the idea of, of breathing, taking your time. Can I offer one suggestion from a practical perspective? So you've done all that, you've grounded yourself, you've taken a breath or two or 10, you've taken your time and still nothing comes.
Mhm.
My go-to, and this, I won't say it's happened often, but this has happened, is I start to physically describe the card.
Mhm.
Now, I'd love to tell you that I made that up. That would be a complete lie. I read it somewhere, and I think I've mentioned before. If I can't remember where I read it, it's probably either Rachel Pollack or Mary Green, or Mary Greer. So I'm going to give them both credit. It's probably one of the two, but the exercise of describing the card itself. Let me see. I've got a deck here. If I pulled an example, so I pulled the Ace of Cups, and if the Ace of Cups were the card that came up, then I would say, and sorry, this is from the This Might Hurt deck, which is the one I'm going to use today. I have the Ace of Cups. I'd be like, there's a cup, one cup that with liquid that's emerging, that's sorry, one cup with a hand, it's emerging from the cloud. Um, the liquid is overflowing from the edges. There's a bird, a dove, it looks like, carrying a leaf or a branch in its claws or in its talons. The water is flowing into a lake because as you start to use that kind of language, the idea of emergence and
Mhm.
flow, dove signals peace. The description of the card itself can start to give you words that link to the meaning of the card. So I would suggest describing the card. You could even start in the foreground and move to the background. You could start with the top third or the top quarter, and then move into the second or the top half, then move into the bottom half. It's a great strategy for when you're really stuck, like when, it's like, oh my goodness, here's this card and I completely forget what it is. Because if you're familiar with the cards and it's just that momentary lapse, then talking yourself through the card is in all likelihood going to trigger some of those memories, or trigger some of those neural connections and bring the meaning of that card back. So that is a go-to strategy for me. So for if there are any clients that are out there, and we're working together and all of a sudden you hear me describing the card, now you know why that
You know
is.
the
So,
secret.
right now I've pulled the curtain away, giving you a
But
little bit.
sometimes when
Of course.
you're just the act of describing the card and the words that you're using, that um whoever you're reading for
Yeah.
will pick up on that word. Like
Right.
when you said lake, it'd be like, oh, well, I'm going to the lake this weekend.
Yeah.
I wonder what that has to do, right?
Yeah.
And then it starts to prompt a conversation. So
Right.
maybe by you being like, oh, I forget what the meaning of this card is, or it does not making sense right now. So I'm describing it. Maybe that's sort of the energy of you to describe the card. So that will prompt something in the
Mhm.
person that you're reading for, like by just describing what's in the card without, the
Yeah,
actual meaning. So,
for sure. And then when that conversation happens, when the person that you're working with starts to react and respond to the what you're describing, then you can start to prompt them with questions about, how does that resonate with you? How does that make you feel? And then really, and then what you're doing is what they had intended for you to do in the first place, and that was to interpret the cards based on the question or the concern or the topic that they're bringing for you. So you have to remember too that describing the card will actually lead to an interpretation, especially if you're working with a visual based card, like the deck, like the Rider-Waite-Smith or like a Rider-Waite-Smith clone. If the images are linked to the interpretation, then describing the card is going to be helpful. And one of the reasons why I do that is because I always use an image based deck, and it is,
Right.
well, it's almost always the Rider-Waite-Smith, but when it's not the Rider-Waite-Smith, then it's usually one that's linked to it. So
Right.
yeah. Um, but yeah, what about you? If you have a go-to strategy, if
Yeah,
you're
another
stuck and the breathing
strategy,
doesn't work,
if the breathing doesn't work
who's
and the
working?
describing, describing what's going on in the card, you can look at what emotion is coming up in that card. So you could be looking at the card and then just seeing what is the general sort of energy or emotion that's being elicited, I guess, in this card. Do the people look happy? Do they not look happy? Right? So if you start describing that, so that's kind of a little bit more going a little bit deeper with describing the card.
Mhm.
How do the people look in the card, or, like what's sort of the look on their face, or what are they doing? So again, that's just another strategy to sort of start describing that. Do you do that also, or is that part of what you would do when you're describing the card?
Yeah, it would really be part of what I would do when describing the card because I'd go, I talk about like I literally describe the card. This is what's there, and then I would go pretty quickly to things like what mood is the card evoking,
Okay.
and what are they doing, even how are they standing, how are they facing, are they facing backwards, which could be a reflection of something that's looking back in time, are they looking
Right.
forward? It's the kind of activity. It's interesting because it's often my interpretive style, anyways, to go pretty deep into a card and to look at that. It's just I would usually start with sort of the general meaning of the card. And when it happens, when you're stuck, what I would suggest is when you start working with the image itself, you're eventually getting to the same place.
Hmm.
You're just going about it in a different way. And I even believe that these exercises, like the way of bringing meaning out through a different pathway, through the description of the card, or through or describing the emotion or mood that's in the card, even describing the scenery that's in the card,
Hmm.
or the because most minor arcana cards, especially in a clone deck like the Rider-Waite-Smith or an RWS clone, are
Right.
scenery based cards. So even describing what's happening can help bring out the meaning of the card. So yeah,
I love that.
that's so yeah. I mean, that's what I would do, and then I think I'd mentioned before I would use multiple cards. So there are times too looking at either an adjacent card or a preceding card or some of the other cards that are there that might help link the card to the story itself. So sometimes, and sometimes if you're drawing blank on one card, then start somewhere else. If you've drawn four cards, you've drawn a card in a spread where something is identified as card one, and then card two, and then card three, and card four. You're using the Celtic Cross, which is 10 cards. You don't have to start at card number one either. You can also take a look at the general overview, and you can do things like counting the number of suits and comparing how many cups there are to how many majors there are to how many swords there are. And you can really take a bird's eye view and then sort of narrow in. And sometimes that dialogue and that language really does then help bring out the meaning of the cards. Because, we're making an assumption that you know something about the card. So the idea is when you're stuck, you don't know how to access that information in that space. At some
Right.
point in time, it's going to come. This is different, I guess, if you were an intuitive reader, and there are people who read cards intuitively. But again, that also means sometimes trusting your gut, sometimes looking at a card and going, okay, not 100% sure what this means, but I think it means that. You can always try that interpretation on, especially if you're working with someone else, and then ask the question, does that resonate with you? No one's going to draw the tower card and describe that card as, oh my goodness, this looks like a really positive opportunity that's coming for you. What I see is joy and pleasure and entertainment. Because if that's what you're looking at, when the tower card shows up and then well, you're using either a very interesting deck or,
Mhm.
you're in some ways misinterpreting the card. Most people are going to look at that card and have a general idea of what it looks like, especially if they're using a picture-based deck. So you can
Mhm.
also kind of go with your gut.
Yeah, I love that too, because I think your intuition does play a big role in this. And um what I was going to say might contradict a little bit what you were saying. Not, I mean, using the
It's okay.
tower card as an
We're
example.
allowed. We're allowed.
We're allowed. But sometimes when a card comes up, you might know what the general meaning of that card is, but you're getting a different feeling about that card. And I think that's okay too. So that could cause you to be like to go blank, to be like, okay, well, I think this card means this, but I'm not really feeling it in that way, or maybe it could, go a little bit of a different direction. So I think it's okay to trust your intuition. That's what the whole process of reading tarot is all about. I think it really does help you to really develop that relationship with your intuition and to trust it more. And like you said before, if a card comes up, maybe don't read that card right away. Look at the other cards. That's also leaning into your intuition as well. So if your intuition is saying, well, maybe leave that card alone for now, let's look at these other cards, and then maybe the meaning of that card will come to you. And that often happens to me. So a lot of times when I'm shuffling, a card will jump out. I'll always honor that card. Um, but I trust my intuition to say, am I going to read that first or am I going to read that after? So sometimes I look at that card and I'm like, oh, I don't think I'm meant to read that now. I'm going to read that after. So really listen to those little nudges that you're getting from your intuition. So I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, no, and thank you for bringing that up. And I'll say, and partially putting me in my place. I didn't mean to be light with the idea of the tower card coming up and
Oh,
somebody
no, no.
misinterpreting it. But you're right, though. There are times when, and you brought up a really good point. The idea that there are times when it is the card, even as we know it, doesn't quite feel right. And I've been in that situation when you work with yourself. It's sometimes it's easier to convince yourself that a card means something because you get it to mean what you think you want it to mean. But the other side of that is that's important to keep note of because we're continuously broadening the basket of interpretation that we have with each card. And sometimes a card shows up where the meaning isn't exactly a textbook meaning, but this is how it's showing up for us. And it's really important to recognize that and even to take note of that because what you've done is you've kind of said, well, this card shows up for me when something like this happens. And there's some real legitimacy to that. That's really personalizing the experience of working with the tarot. Or if you're working with someone else, even using language, I'm going out on a limb here, or I'm feeling this, which is different from how I would interpret this card before. So I'm going to share this with you. Know that this is actually coming from a different place, but I feel
Mhm.
it important or I feel called to share it with you anyways. And I think if you're upfront with someone and you're letting them know that this is the space in which you're sharing this information, there's value in that as well because they're going to tell you one of two things. They're going to say, "Oh my goodness, that absolutely resonates with this issue that I'm bringing forward. I can see how this connects." Or they're going to say, "No, I don't see this at all." And then you get an opportunity to perhaps use that in another context or to move on from it. So,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
Another thing that I quite often do, even if I'm not drawing a blank, but I will use this if I am drawing a blank. When I'm working with somebody, I'll show them the card. Well, I mean, they can see the card because we're
Right.
working together, but I'll ask them to ask them, what do you see? Like, how do
Yeah.
you feel when you look at this card? What do you see in this card? So it's they're
Mhm.
interpreting the card for themselves, and it's interesting to see what they come up with. So that's a really great strategy. If you are drawing a blank, that you just ask them, say, well, what do you see in this card? And then that starts the conversation as well. But I do love to do that regardless. And a lot of times if I'm pulling the card and I'm not drawing a blank, I'll I'll still ask them because I want to see what their perspective is. And that's a really nice way of helping, like you're working together rather than you just giving all the information and them just receiving. They're part of that conversation. So I love that tip. And I think you mentioned that or you alluded to that a little bit earlier. So
Well, and I get the sense that you and I, well, I mean, we both also read for each other as well in different spaces, that we are, there is a collaboration to the styles in which we work. So not, both Bonnie and I would be the kind of tarot consultants or readers that would engage the person that we're working with. It's not always the case, but I always think when it's a conversation that's centered around the tarot or that's centered through the tarot, then if a conversation is bidirectional, then getting a person to talk about what they see in the card, and for me, the language I always use is, how does that resonate with you, or what are you seeing inside this card,
mhm.
is always great. And then the one strategy I'm going to mention, and I would probably, state I wouldn't do this if I was working with a client, but I would do this if I was working with friends, family, or by myself, is if you're really stuck, look at the bloody book. If you if you've got a good
Oh
resource
man.
that you've been using, crack the page open and go, all right, what does, whatever book it happens to be, what does the book say about this card? So don't be afraid to do that either. And sometimes, especially when you're working on your own, to have a favorite reference guide, to have your favorite book there with you, just in case, you are stuck, is not a bad thing. Not a bad thing to have at all. I know in the spaces that we do our practice, tarot and tea, and where we met, Megan, who is the co-owner of the business that we work in, always has reference books available for people, and also because there are people of all abilities there as well, so they can go and grab a reference and can learn a little bit about a card, especially when it's a card that might not show up very often, or if it's a card that has been problematic for you from an interpretation perspective. That does happen. Just, pick up the book, crack open the spine, and have a look. I don't know. What do you think about
Oh, 100. Well, I do that every day. So when I pull cards, yeah, right.
that?
I pull cards for myself and then I do my own interpretation before I go to the books. And so I'll, sort of automatic write what's coming up when I'm seeing those cards. But then I love to go to the book,
Mhm.
especially the book of the deck that
The
I'm
deck.
using,
Yeah.
like because I want to see how they're interpreting that card. And then it always maybe sometimes gives me new ways to look at the card. So I am generally looking at the book after I've already done my interpretation of the card when I do that for myself, 100%. But I love to read and I love to learn. So that's just sort of my style of gathering information and trying to learn more.
Well,
So
and especially when you're working with a deck that's unfamiliar, that's new, and I would do the same thing, right? I would do the same thing when I'm working with a deck. I'm really curious to know, especially if it's a deck that comes with a book that's been either written or co-written with the creator of the deck. I want to know how they've interpreted a particular card, because I think that helps, I'll say, broaden the basket or broaden the canon. You've heard me use this language before, of interpretation for that card. And I want to add that to all the other iterations of that same card, because I really do believe that the tarot is a collective of not just one deck or not just core decks, but it's the collective of all decks that have been created in that 78 card structure with a major and a minor arcana. And
mhm,
how has the artist interpreted that deck. One of my favorite decks, and is one I still go to. I actually have an app. I have the app and slash book on my phone. Is Joanna's the Gaian Tarot. I Because the images themselves are so different from the deck that I'm used to, but that I love the deck so much, I find myself going, okay, well, I know that this is the Four of Fire, and I have a general idea what that means and what it links to with the Four of Wands, but what did Joanna mean when she did, when she put this particular, with the person dancing around a fire, dancing around, the hearth of a flame? And then I want to go and take a look and see what she had to say as well. So there's value in that exercise, that it's not it's not judgment on your ability or inability to read cards. That it really is.
Mhm.
It is a really great learning tool, and there can be some awesome resources out there to use.
For sure. And I find too, I'm sure this happens to everybody, but there are certain cards in the deck that when you pull them, you're always like, oh, this card, right? Like it, I
The
find
moon,
some
the moon.
the
Sorry.
moon, yeah. Me, it's like the seven of swords or even the seven of like the sevens trip me up sometimes. So it's like, and the seven of swords haunts me. Like I pull that card all the time and I'm always reading about it. And I'm like, so I think sometimes with those cards that,
Yeah.
uh may be difficult for you to interpret when they show up, it's good to get different perspectives of that card because maybe you just haven't connected to an actual meaning of that
Mhm.
card or it hasn't been explained in a way that really resonates with you. So definitely when those cards show up and you're just like, oh, this one again, what does that mean? And that can happen a lot of times with the court cards for people because the courts seem to be really difficult to interpret sometimes or to really get a grasp on. So looking up the definitions for those and going back and rereading stuff is definitely helpful. So
I would agree. I would agree. Yeah. Anything else that I'm trying to think of anything else I want to add? I think I'm done, especially if we're
I think
talking
you're
about,
done.
well, about what to do when we draw sort of blank using the tarot. I have nothing else to offer, but you might. So
I might just like one last thing,
yeah.
and we've probably already talked about this, but just telling a story. What story do you see in that card, or continuing a story, especially if there's people in the card or animals? How are they talking to each other? How does, the first, like if you're pulling maybe three cards or you have multiple cards, how is that card connecting to the next card? Can you
Mhm.
see a storyline or even like once upon a time? And then go into the card. So really our intuition is basically our imagination. And sometimes we discount our imagination, but really that's our intuition speaking to us. So if you can tell a story by looking at a card and you're just making it up, that's still another form of, exercising that intuitive muscle that you have. So even play around with it. Again, I like to remind myself of this of like have fun, don't be so serious, right? If that happens, see what you can get out of that. So
Yeah.
maybe yeah, making up a story like,
Mhm.
oh, there's a knight and this knight is going on a quest and he's looking for fire because there's, I don't know, no heat in the castle. Like, I don't know, like
Yeah,
just
yeah.
make something up, but who knows where that's going to go.
What a great suggestion. I might borrow that one actually because it is, well, it's a great narrative tool. The tarot is a really good narrative tool because it's a series of images, and when you string them together, it's going to tell an infinite number of stories. If I, I'm not adept in mathematics enough to know what the permutation of 78 cards and what your odds are of drawing a particular narrative, but
Mhm.
my guess would be that you're rarely going to draw the same cards in the same sequence, over a period of time. So the story's going to be different every time for sure.
Yeah.
Speaking of stories, should we use our decks now to try and tell a story with one card?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna grab. I pulled the card from the Ace of Cups from the deck I had set and ready to go because I wanted to use this might. I'm just gonna make sure I don't have it upside down. Use the
Oh,
This
okay.
Might Hurt deck,
Okay.
because somebody in one of my recent classes was asking about how I compare using one deck to the other and the symbols that are in one deck versus another. So it sort of forced me to think, okay, well, maybe I should use a deck that's similar to the Rider Waite Smith, but that's a little bit different.
I think I know who asked you that question,
Yeah,
Peter.
I know. I know who did too, but I wasn't gonna say. It's just
He's talking about me. I asked him a question in one of his classes and now he's calling me out on it.
well, I didn't call you out on it at all, actually. I just made a general statement. But do you want to
His
draw
classes
first?
are awesome, by the way.
Do you want to draw first?
I don't know. I can.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'm using Tarot of the Abyss by Anna Turian.
I'll
Another
stop
black
shuffling.
and white deck. I think you have this deck, Peter.
No, I don't. I don't know.
You don't have Tarot of the Abyss?
Mm-mm.
Oh, I thought you did. This is what the box
No,
looks like.
I don't
If
have it.
you're watching on YouTube, it's incredible. It's I think she like actually drew the cards. There,
Okay.
yeah, there's no color. They're black and white, but it's a beautiful deck. So I I'm going to pick a card. Oh, we were talking about this card earlier before we filmed the podcast.
Oh,
This
we
is
did.
the
Yeah, that's
Four
right.
of
That's
Cups.
right. Yes. Yeah.
Um,
And not
so
the
the
four of wands, the four of cups.
Not the Four of Wands, exactly. This is the Four of Cups. It's very similar to a Rider-Waite
Mhm.
Smith depiction of this card. It has a man sitting in a tree. He's looking at three cups, and there's another cup off to the side, kind of spilling over, but he can't see that cup. So the Four of Cups is an interesting card for me. It can mean quite a few different things. The first sense I get when I see that card is maybe missing an opportunity. So, and again, I reflect on myself when I see this card. It's like this idea maybe sometimes of boredom or that you feel stuck. You're staring at three cups that are in front of you, and you're just like, so fixated on these three cups that there's another cup that's being offered to you. And quite often it's the hand. And they say it's like the ace of cups, right? That hand that's bringing in another cup. And we don't see that cup, that opportunity, because we're looking at these three cups that are in front of us. So it is a card of stability because it's a four. So you're probably not in a state, of disarray or anything. Like it's probably pretty stable, but what is it that you're looking at, and how can you sort of broaden that perspective to be open to new opportunities that are being presented to you? Because right now you're not seeing them because you're looking at these three other cups. I've often, I don't know, maybe it was even you that said this, Peter. Is this like the bored housewife cup or card
Uh,
or something?
I don't think that was me. No,
That
but
wasn't you?
no, not
But
me.
it's kind of like this, like I'm stuck or I'm bored or I'm so full, like after you eat a meal, you're so full that you couldn't eat anything else. That's kind of like that energy of this card. But I've seen also this card referred to as like going inward, like to
Mhm.
meditate or, to some self-discovery, like just taking that time. So it sort of has those couple of meanings, but for me, I see it as missing an opportunity, like an opportunity is being presented to me, and maybe I'm not open to receive that because I'm focused as to what's in front of me. What would you add to that? Or how
Yeah,
do you see that card?
that would probably be the most common interpretation that I would look at, the idea of a missed opportunity because I'm focused on what's in front of me. Um, at times, I've seen it sort of reflect a bit, um, not of a meditative state, but of an emotional lull because it's
Mhm.
the cups. Whereas for me, the card of meditation would be the Four of Swords. It'd be that idea of
Mhm.
that stable, quiet mind, and the image in a lot of decks would show that. That this one would be the idea of that almost even keel of emotion.
Mhm.
But there are times, and more recently, where I've thought about the card and thought, well, they're focused on three cups, and if we think about what the Three of Cups means,
Mm.
it's the idea of joy and celebration. So I also wonder if it's a card that is slightly melancholic,
Yeah.
where what they're focused on is what was. That the Three of Cups in relation to the Four of Cups is actually in the past. That the good time, has already happened. The celebration and joy that surrounds the emotional joy that surrounds the Three of Cups has already happened, and they're pining over that. They're focused on that, and they're missing the new emotional opportunity that's actually presenting itself behind them.
Mhm.
So what I've kind of done is I've looked at that because visually it almost looks like the Three of Cups plus the One of Cups plus the Ace of Cups, and I've started to add that interpretation to my interpretive basket. I don't know if that resonates with
No,
you.
I love that. I'm gonna look at that card now with that lens as well, because yeah, it could almost be like, oh, looking at like thinking back to the good times
The
and
good
oh,
old
I
days,
wish
right?
I
Yeah,
had that right
yeah,
now, right?
yeah.
But emotions are in constant flux, and I've seen that card described like that before,
Mhm.
that maybe you're feeling like this now, but it's not going to stay that way,
That's right.
right? Like
Yeah. Yeah. It's okay to feel like that. It's not okay to sit in that for a long time. Yeah, exactly.
right, exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good card. You're right. We were talking about it in a faux pas that I made, and I'm not gonna, I'm not going to call myself out on it. Instead, I'm going to shuffle this deck. I won't
You're gonna
shuffle it
shuffle
much.
the deck.
Oh, stayed in the realm of cups. So
Ooh.
I have drawn the Eight of Cups. So I am using
Ah.
I'm using the This Might Hurt deck by Isabella Rotman. So I'll just show you the back. And then I actually have got the box here. I can show you the box. Box looks a little bit different. So this one is available, in most of your, friendly neighborhood esoteric stores. But this one I bought just before Liminal 11 did the mass production. I actually bought it from Isabella's site itself. It's a gorgeous deck. It's probably become one of my favorite, but nonetheless. So we've got the Eight of Cups here. And if you take a look, this is actually, if this card had a title, it would be I'm done. I'm done. I'm emotionally spent. I'm leaving things behind. I'm heading in a new direction. Now, this card is very, because I had said, I want to take a look at the cards in a way that and kind of compares how I would interpret it in the Rider-Waite-Smith than here. And one of the differences is in the Rider-Waite-Smith, this is almost a card of abandonment, that all eight cups are still standing and the person is walking away. That's not the case here, actually, but half the cups are smashed. And in
Mm.
some ways, this person is actually walking away from this experience before they actually lose everything. So it's not a situation that is completely hopeless. It is a situation where they're like, you know what? I'm getting out actually before I lose everything. And the other thing that is apparent in this card, and for those of you that can see it, I'll actually bring it down now, but I'll describe it for those of you who can't. So it's eight cups, the person's abandoning. Four of them have been smashed. They're actually glass goblets. But the person who's actually walking away is wearing a hiking pack and a hiking stick, and they look like they've prepared for this journey. So this person who is walking away from, and again, right, we're talking about cups, so it's likely something that they care deeply about. Could be a relationship, but it could also be a project or an endeavor that was close to their heart. They've prepared for it. They've packed for this trip. They have really thought about it and have made the conscious decision to move on. Now, like I said, in the Rider-Waite-Smith, and look, I probably could pull it because I got the Rider-Waite-Smith somewhere, but I won't. But I know it well enough to know that it's actually eight cups that are standing, and the person is walking away from eight standing cups. And actually, in Aleister Crowley's deck, in the top deck, it's actually called indolence, which is like avoidance or even laziness, like kind of walking away from something without putting any energy into it. But this is a little bit different in this deck, is this deck looks like it's somebody who's actually had the forethought to walk away before they lose everything. So that Eight of Cups is a card of abandonment, but it is really a decision to abandon a situation. It's like I'll go right back to my first word. I'm done with this. This is I'm done with this card, and I'm walking away. What about you? What insights would you bring to the Eight of Cups?
Yeah, I have a couple of different ways of looking at that card. I guess depending on the situation or the question, but I do see it as walking away from something. I believe that it's, walking away from something that no longer serves you, whether that's good or bad.
Right.
So it could be that you're walking away because you have to walk away because that situation is no longer good. But it could also be about almost like an adventure. Like there's this thing that I
Mhm.
want to do, but in order for me to do that, I have to leave something
Right.
behind. Am I ready to do that? So it's like this courage to, and sometimes it's just like leaving your comfort zone. It's like, well, things are good here, but I want to do that thing. But am I crazy to do that? Like, so it's kind of, where are you in that state? Like, are you leaving a situation because it just doesn't work for you anymore? Or are you actually going in search of something that you want to do, but you're still leaving something behind, which doesn't necessarily have to mean something that's, like a really difficult card. Because I think sometimes when we see that card, it's kind of like, oh, you're walking away from something, but you could be walking towards something that you really want.
Yeah.
And I think
Interesting.
sometimes it could be referred to as like a trip, like you're going somewhere. Um, So that's kind of my interpretation of the Eight of Cups. I usually think about me again, like something isn't serving me anymore and I have to leave it behind because I can't move forward if I'm still holding on to this belief or this pattern.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Interesting. Because I know, and I went hunting for the Rider Waite. So this is so again, for people who can't see it, it's the eight cups still standing up. But what I noticed and remembered about the card is, as you mentioned, the difference between the two decks is Isabella Rotman's deck doesn't actually have a visible destination, that the person is walking
Mm.
kind of into the darkness, into the mountains. Whereas in the Rider-Waite-Smith and Pamela Coleman-Smith's artwork, in the very distance, you can actually see what looks like another town, on the other side of the mountain. So the person is actually leaving something to go somewhere else. It's interesting, how you bring that up, and how sometimes different images can lead to slightly different interpretations. So, but also interesting that we both drew from the suit of cups today. So
Yeah, and we doubled our
we
numbers. So I
doubled
pulled a
those, right?
four and you
Four, and I
pulled
pulled
an
an eight.
eight,
Yeah,
which those are quite, similar in terms of stability and
yeah, yeah. The eight has a little bit more movement in it, but yeah, that's that idea of, yeah, excellent. All right. I think that's it, right? Are we done? We're gonna
yeah,
let people
we're
know
done.
where they
How
can.
would you want to tell people how they can find you, how they can take your
Sure.
course that I'm taking, which is awesome?
Well, look, as Bonnie mentioned, yep, you can take my course, which apparently is awesome. Right now, I'm actually in the middle of the live cohort for the Major Arcana. So at the present time, I actually have what I call the Learn the Tarot series. It started with a beginner's overview, a 5-lesson course called The Beginner's Journey. The second course was a 4-lesson course that did a deeper dive into the minor arcana, so the 4 suits from an elemental perspective, as well as the court cards, and then how to use the cards. And then this last class is a really deep dive into the major arcana, where we look at each of the archetypes and images associated with the card. And then we look at a few different correspondence systems, like the astrological correspondence system. We'll look at the Kabbalistic tree of life. And then we'll also look, because I always think, the tarot is a practical tool. We'll look at different ways that we can use the major arcana from a practice perspective. So if learning is something that is of interest to you, I would encourage you to go check out my offerings at peterwhitetarot.com. You can click on courses or you can click on shop. I think courses will give you an outline of what the courses are. Shop will allow you to register for the class. So that's it for me. How about for you, Bonnie? What do you've got going on? Where can people find you? How can they learn from you?
Best way is through my website, which is breathewithbonnie.com, which will be in the show notes. So you can find out what I'm doing, the services that I offer there, if I have any new blog posts. So yeah, everything that I do is on there. Sometimes I go on social media and you can find me at Breathe with Bonnie on Instagram. So yeah.
Perfect. All right. Well, on that note, let's thank everybody for coming to join us today at the Tarot Table with Bonnie and Peter, and we will see you at our next episode. Bye for now, everyone.
Bye.